Section 10. Since I have centered all my considerations on the problems of experienced space, miniature, for me, is solely a visual image. But the causality of smallness stirs all our senses, and an interesting study could be undertaken of the miniatures that appeal to each sense. For the sense of taste or smell, the problem might be even more interesting than for the sense of vision, since sight curtails the dramas it witnesses. But a whiff of perfume, or even the slightest odor, can create an entire environment in the world of the imagination. Naturally, the problems of causality of smallness have been analyzed by sensory psychology. In a perfectly positive way, the psychologist carefully determines the different thresholds at which the various sense organs go into action. These thresholds may differ with different persons, but there is no contesting their reality. In fact, the idea of threshold is one of the most clearly objective ideas in modern psychology. In this paragraph, I should like to see if the imagination does not attract us to an area beyond these thresholds. If a poet who is hyper alert to the inner word, by making form and color speak, doesn't hear in a region beyond perception. There exist too many paradoxical metaphors in this connection for us to not examine them systematically, since they must conceal a certain reality, a certain truth of the imagination. I shall give some examples of what, for the sake of brevity, I shall call sound miniatures. First of all, we must discuss the usual references to problems of hallucination, for they refer to objective phenomena detectable in actual behavior that can be recorded thanks to photographs of faces in anguish at hearing imaginary voices. They would therefore not allow us to really enter into the domains of pure imagination. Nor do I believe that we can apprehend the autonomous activity of the creative imagination through a mixture of true sensations and hallucinations that may either be true or false. The problem for me, I repeat, is not to examine men, but images. The only images that can be examined phenomenologically are transmissible ones. They are those we receive in a successful transmission. And even if the creator of an image were the victim of a hallucination, the image can very well fulfill our desire to imagine as readers who are not hallucinated. It may be recognized that a veritable ontological change took place when what psychiatrists designate as auditory hallucinations were given literary dignity by a great writer like Edgar Allan Poe. In such a case, psychological or psychoanalytical explanations concerning the author of the work of art can lead to a situation where problems of the creative imagination would be posed wrongly, or not at all. In general, too, facts do not explain values. And in works of the poetic imagination, values bear the mark of such novelty that everything related to the past is lifeless beside them. All memory has to be reimagined. For we have in our memories microfilms that can only be read if they are lighted by the bright light of the imagination. Yeah. Naturally, it can still be affirmed that Poe wrote The Fall of the House of Usher because he suffered from auditory hallucinations. But suffer runs counter to create, and we may be sure that it was not while he was suffering that he wrote this tale, in which the images are brilliantly associated and the shades and silences have very delicately corresponding features. Terrestrial objects were glowing in the darkness. Words were murmurs. A sensitive ear knows that this is a poet writing in prose, and that a certain poet, a certain, ah, and that at a certain point, poetry dominates meaning. In short, in the auditory category, we have here an immense sound miniature, the miniature of an entire cosmos that speaks softly. Faced with such a miniature of world sounds as this, a phenomenologist must systematically point out all that goes beyond perception, organically as well as objectively. This is not a matter of ears burning or of wall lizards growing bigger. I don't get the reference, but okay. Oh. There's a dead woman in a vault who doesn't want to die. On a shelf in the library are very old books that tell of another past than the one the dreamer has known. Dreams, thoughts, and memories weave a single fabric. The soul dreams and thinks, then it imagines. The poet has brought us to an extreme situation beyond which we are afraid to venture, a situation that lies between mental disorder and reason, between the living and a woman who is dead. The slightest sound prepares a catastrophe, while mad winds prepare a general chaos. Murmur and clangor go hand in hand. We are taught the ontology of presentiment. In this tense state of forehearing, we are asked to become aware of the slightest indications. And in this cosmos of extremes, things are indications before they are phenomena. The weaker the indication, the greater the significance, since it indicates an origin. Taken as origins, it seems as though all these indications occur and reoccur without the tale coming to an end. Here, genius teaches us some quite simple things. The tale ends by taking root in our consciousness and, for this reason, becomes the possession of the phenomenologist. Meanwhile, consciousness increases, not, however, in relations between human beings, upon which psychoanalysis generally bases its observations. For it is not possible to concentrate on human problems in the face of a cosmos in danger. Everything lives in a sort of pre-quake, in a house about to collapse beneath the weight of walls which, when they too collapse, will have achieved definitive burial for a dead woman. But this cosmos is not real. As Poe himself said, it is a sulphurous ideality, created by the dreamer with each new wave of his images. Man and the world, man and his world, are at their closest, it being in the power of the poet to designate them to us in their moments of greatest proximity. Man and the world are in a community of dangers. They are dangerous for each other. All this can be heard and pre-heard in the sub-rumbling murmur of the poem. But my demonstration of the reality of poetic sound miniatures will be simpler, no doubt, if I take miniatures that are less composed. I shall therefore choose examples that may be contained in a few lines. Poets often introduce us into a world of impossible sounds, so impossible, in fact, that their authors may be charged with creating fantasy that has no interest. One smiles and goes one's way. And yet, most often, the poet did not take his poem lightly, and a certain tenderness presided over these images. René Guy Cadeau, who lived in the village of Happy Homes, was moved to write, "You can hear the prattle of the flowers on the screen." Because all flowers speak and sing, even those we draw, and it is impossible to remain unsociable when we draw a flower or a bird. Another poet writes, "Her secret was listening to flowers wear out their color." Like so many poets, Claude Vigée hears the grass grow. "I hear a young nut tree grow green." Such images as these must be taken, at the least, in their existence as a reality of expression, for they owe their entire being to poetic expression, and this being would be diminished if we tried to refer them to a reality, even to a psychological reality. Indeed, they dominate psychology and correspond to no psychological impulse save the simple need for self-expression, in one of those leisurely moments when we listen to everything in nature that is unable to speak. It would be quite superfluous for such images to be true. They exist. They possess the absoluteness of the image, and they have passed beyond the limit that separates conditioned from absolute sublimation. But even when they start from psychology, the turning away from psychological impressions to poetic expression is sometimes so subtle that one is tempted to attribute a basis of psychological reality to what is pure expression. The terrain writer, J. Moreau, could not resist the pleasure of quoting Théophile Gautier when he gives poetic form to the impressions he had while smoking hashish. My hearing, Gautier wrote, became enormously keen. I heard the noises of colors. Green, red, blue, yellow sounds came to me in perfectly distinct waves. But Moreau was not taken in, and he notes that he quoted the poet's words in spite of the poetic exaggeration that marks them, and which it is useless to point out. For, but then, for whom is this document intended? For the psychologist or for the philosopher who's interested in the poetic human being? In other words, is it the hashish or the poet that exaggerates? Alone, the hashish would not have succeeded in exaggerating so well. And we quiet readers, whose knowledge of hashish impressions has been acquired through literary proxy, would not hear color shudder if a poet had not known how to make us listen, not to say super listen. Then how shall we see without hearing? There exist complicated forms which, even when they are at rest, make a noise. Twisted things continue to make creaking contortions. As Rimbaud knew this when he listened to mangy trellises crawling. The form of the mandrake maintains its legend. Indeed, this root in human form must cry out when it is pulled up from the ground, and for ears that dream what a noise of syllables there is in its name. Words are clamor-filled shells. There is many a story in the miniature of a single word. There are also great waves of silence that vibrate in poems, as in the little selection of poems by Pericle Potocki, prefaced by Marcel Raymond. Here we have the silence of the distant world concentrated in one line. Far off, I heard the springs of earth praying. Some poems move toward silence the way we descend in memory, as for instance in this great poem by Melose. While the high wind yelps the names of women long dead, or the sound of bitter old rain on a road, listen. Now there's nothing but complete silence. Listen. Here there is nothing that would require the kind of poetic imitation to be found in Victor Hugo's great play, Les Digens. It is the silence, rather, that obliges the poet to listen and gives the dream greater intimacy. We hardly know where to situate this silence, whether in the vast world or in the immense past, but we do know that it comes from beyond a wind that dies down or a rain that grows gentle. In another poem, we find this unforgettable line by Melose. The odor of silence is so old. As life grows older, we are besieged by many a silence.